we should go ahead and get started, if that sounds okay.
Yes.
With a quick welcome. So everyone, welcome back. Welcome back to the fall series, our colloque series, our flagship offering here at the Ostrom Workshop. Thank you, despite we know suffering from Zoom fatigue, for joining us again. We really very much appreciate it. And we're extremely excited about the lineup of Colloquium and research series events, as well as other special events that we have going this fall, along with some exciting new initiatives that we'll be talking to you guys more about as they come to fruition and formalization that we brainstormed at our retreat this last week. First off, though, let me welcome Inza Thiesfeld, who I'll be turning the floor over to in just a moment, as our new interim director of the Commons program after Bill retired this past summer. And thanks so much again to Bill for his service as our program director, as well as for his decades of service to the workshop and more importantly to the community writ large. And Inza, we're so incredibly thankful and grateful that you're able to take this up where Bill left off and continue to build out this program and deepen ties with IASC, since you are also the current president of IASC. So we're just absolutely thrilled by this partnership and by all the opportunities there. So thank you, Inza, and welcome. And also we wanted to welcome our new grants coordinator, Brendan Devine. So if there's any affiliates on the line who are thinking about new grant opportunities, and if the workshop could be a piece of that or could help, Brendan is excited to work with you on those opportunities as well. So as I said, welcome, come one, come all. There's going to be a series of new announcements coming out shortly about the fun stuff that we're working on. As a sneak peek, there's a summer academy that we're planning. That's going to be a lot of fun, an incubator concept as well to help support innovative interdisciplinary social science research, along with some expansion of our visiting scholars program and some other initiatives. So we're excited. We hope you will be too. And if there's anything that you feel like the workshop could be doing, better or differently to help support you and all the great work that you're all doing, please don't hesitate to reach out. Let us know. As a final quick reminder, I have a regular office hour every Monday at 11 o'clock Eastern. So please, would love to connect. But I have the joy and privilege now of turning things over to Inza Thiesfeld as our moderator for today, who will be teeing up our wonderful guest speaker, our colloque speaker, to kick things off the series this fall, Achim Schluter, who's going to be talking about securing property rights for small-scale fisheries to property for efficient producers. It's really a fascinating case study, and I'm so happy we get to highlight this work. So without further ado, Inza, over to you, and welcome again.
Thanks, Scott, for the introduction. Yeah, I'm also very happy to have the chance to lead this Commons Governance program for the coming year. It's extremely great that we have at the same time the chance to kick off the Colloquium series right away with a real Commons Governance paper that Achim will present to us in a second. And I think you already mentioned the title, so I have just some more information for the crowd here about Achim. I would call Achim a real research scholar of the workshop or workshopper. So I just spent a minute with Gail to check how often you have been here. I will not list that, but you can be convinced that Achim has a quite good knowledge of what has been going on here in the past, and most likely also what will happen in the future, and is very close to the Ostrom workshop and also to the Commons Governance program. Achim Schluter holds a PhD in economics and then his dissertation in environmental economics in 2001, and that's actually also from Humboldt University at the time when we met, as I just started there at that time. So we had quite some overlap. And after that, I could witness how Achim moved from land governance to forestry governance in Freiburg until he finally ended up with marine ecosystem governance. So quite a loop and quite an interdisciplinary scholar, so even really perfect for starting our debate today. He is currently working as a group leader of institutional and behavioral economics and department leader of the social science department, and that's at the Leibniz Research Center for Tropical Marine Research in Bremen in Germany. So I think, Achim, without further introduction, we are just happy to learn about the details of the privatization study you have for us today. And then hopefully we have some time to discuss also your insights and pose our questions. So floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Insa, for that kind introduction, and also thank you for inviting me. Also, thanks to Alison for organizing all those things perfectly. I'm pretty sad that I can't be in Bloomington physically, but on the other hand, I mean, I have I think 3 US Americans in my in my working group, but nevertheless it was pretty impressive to listen to Scott's pretty enthusiastic opening and whatever, and I felt very much welcomed by the US American culture. So basically that Zoom shock which I got being dumped into the US American culture was pretty impressive, and I'm very happy that I'm here and that I have the opportunity to discuss with you. So I'm presenting that paper about scallop culture in Peru, and I briefly present my co-authors, Lotta Kluger. She's from Kiel University. She's an ecologist, basically focusing on social ecological modeling. Gerardo da Monte, he is from the Pontificia in Peru. He is a social anthropologist, and Maria Garzogais, she is a biologist from Bremen University, and we're working all together in a project which is called Humboldt's Tipping, and that's where this work basically comes from. So it doesn't relate to Humboldt's Tipping at Humboldt University, Insa, because you were laughing, but it relates obviously to the Humboldt Current, which is at the coast of Peru, and which might break down or change substantially. As a starting point, I want to briefly tell you, I mean, Insa told a little bit about my career and how I meandered from agriculture to forestry and then to the marine realm. And I basically want to make some publicity, knowing that many of you might not work in the marine realm, why I think it's so fascinating. Basically, from my perspective, basically the marine realm is the last economic frontier. You might have heard about all those blue growth strategies, blue economy and so on. And to a certain degree, that's the largest or the most gigantic commons we still have. And there are processes of enclosure on its way. And we will observe a lot of kind of privatization, a lot of establishment of property rights. Might it be to pollution problems, might it be to problems of overuse, but we will also see a lot of enclosure and basically property rights held in private hands to the sea, which is currently still the commons. And so from that perspective, I think it's a super interesting object to study for studying institutional change. It has important functions for the Earth system. So from that perspective, it's pretty vital that we basically understand those processes and think about intelligence forms of property rights. And obviously, it's societally a very, very important issue. A lot of people, marginalized people, are basically relying on the sea and require resources from the sea. And from that perspective, it's nice actually to try to think and try to help to that puzzle, how to make actually so sure that we're going through this process with a good social, environmental, let's call it, performance. Here in that study, we're just looking to one of those particular cases happening, and obviously the scope of the paper is much more modest. And what I try to do, or what we try to do in that paper, that we try to understand basically the privatization process, which basically consists of 10 years licenses you get of the sea floor in Sechura Bay. and you can use it then for scallop bottom culture. And this is actually a pretty short-term process. It lasted only 30 to 40 years. So basically it starts in the 80s, taking a little bit more momentum in the 90s. And from there, that privatization process started. And you might not be able to see that on the right picture, but these are basically all those little licenses. Each of them has 100 hectares, and their bottom scallop culture is done. That is basically the aim of the paper, of the overall paper, which you already also got before. But basically the aim of that presentation is also discuss with you, obviously a lot of scholars around here. You will see it focuses on the IAD framework, and it tries to basically add to the IAD framework to be able to understand that particular puzzle. And for me, it's obviously very interesting to have the opportunity to discuss basically the analytical lens we are taking. Before I'm going into the analytical lens, I'm going to briefly present you the process of scallop bottom culture. This is basically such a plot, obviously, and that shows already, if we would work on agriculture, then you could see a fence and whatever, it would be pretty well demarcated to a certain degree. But here, obviously, you cannot see that this is actually a plot which belongs to somebody. The only indication which might indicate that it belongs to somebody is that you see those boats, or the boat is basically there for monitoring. And I mean here monitoring in the sense of controlling that nobody actually gets into that plot. So somebody is living on that boat for 8 months roughly. I mean, they're obviously exchanged and they are not staying there for 8 months, but there are constantly people on that boat for monitoring, first of all, that nobody is actually stealing the resource, but also for controlling from an ecological monitoring perspective that the scallops, which are pretty valuable, the scallops which you're putting on one of those plots, usually due to investment scarcity, they are putting roughly 30,000 euros on such one of those plots. But if you would go to full size, you could easily invest 60,000, 80,000 euros on such a plot and grow those seeds for 8 months. Now, so this is basically where it takes place. For actually monitoring, you need a lot of compressor diving. I just realized when I looked at the body shape of that diver, that this is not a Peruvian fisherman, but it's just my colleague who is doing compressor diving, which is not allowed actually in a German institute because it's quite risky. But there, everything is done basically by compressor diving, and you need to do a lot of compressor diving for it, just for monitoring, for looking that the scallops are not basically evading the plot, and then obviously also for harvesting basically the scallops once they arrive. And these are a lot of tons you have to basically lift from the sea floor. You need a lot of those transport ships. You need roughly 10 of those transport boats to bring those scallops. You can imagine that we're all lifted by divers, or a diver who uses a compressor to dive, and you have a lot of tons per hectare, which you're basically lifting, and you're bringing them to the harbor. There are huge hygienic requirements because particularly those scallops are made for export, or they are produced for export and ending up in French supermarkets. So once they are harvested there, they're going to the port and quickly put into lorries and brought into a factory where they are processed, and basically within 24 hours they are deep frozen and they end up, as already said, in a French supermarket, or here in, or if they're lucky and COVID allows, they're ending up as a delicacy in restaurants. Okay, I think that might suffice for you to understand what that business is actually about. And I now go into the analytical framework, which we've used to basically analyze what happened there over the last 30, 40 years. So we've taken the IAD framework and we thought, oh, this cyclical matter to a certain degree is pretty good for understanding those processes which went on in iterative terms, basically having changes in informal, formal rights and so on until that private regime basically emerged. So that was one source. And then as another source, we were working in the last 3-4 years in a cost network, European cost network, Ocean for Sustainable Governance. And there we created a subgroup because many people are aware that there is happening a privatization or enclosure of the marine realm. And so we created basically a study group on privatization, and it's an interdisciplinary group where we came basically up with a list of criteria where we thought they are important for understanding privatization processes in the marine realm. We published that in Ecology and Society. I forgot to copy you the link into the chat. I potentially will do later on. I will move back into that and explain it slightly further in a minute. But what we did was basically taking those two sources and we brought them together and created basically like an extended IAD framework where you could say we are creating basically a second tier level for the IAD framework. This is actually a process which is ongoing, and that is the first application of the case, and we're still working on developing this framework basically, which is adapted to privatization process in the marine realm. And from that perspective, I'm very happy to discuss it here. So just a very brief introduction or a little bit more detail on that list of criteria which we have published in that paper called Broadening the Perspective of Ocean Privatization. As said, it was an interdisciplinary team. So there were astronomians or economists, sociologists, geographers, social anthropologists joining that discussion, people with a rather Australian perspective like me or political economy perspective. Martin Babbing, for example, was involved, who is very much focusing on interactive governance theory. You have people from political ecology or Marxist perspectives, and we really thought, okay, without a clear normative perspective, we only want to know which are the important issues addressed when you consider privatization process, which are the important aspects when you're looking into the literature, and things which appeared where, for example, motivations and drivers. So you have privatization processes which are emerging due to scarcity issues, due to overexploitation, rent securitization, incentives for innovations are given, and therefore we have privatization processes. Think of, for example, property rights, patents, and so on. We have to consider who are basically the main pushing actors. Sometimes the state is pushing, NGOs might pushing, small-scale fishers, as you will see, are sometimes pushing. Then obviously what we also realize is that materiality, or how you would call it in the IAD framework, biophysical characteristics are pretty important for understanding what kind of privatization process is going on. The institutional starting point, do you start from open access, or do you have already kind of, for example, a traditional use system in place? Do you have a situation of legal pluralism and so on? Which kind of attributes are privatized? what kind of institutional repertoire is there. So if you have, for example, ITQs already, or if they do not exist, obviously gives you a different array of possibilities for privatizing. Path dependencies are involved. Distributive effects are always important. Are of importance, or effects on decision making and democracy. I'm just thinking of a presentation with Svein Jentoft gave once at the ZMT, and there he was talking about a privatization of an island in Nicaragua for conservation purposes, and how much that actually locked out and reduced the ability. You have that quite often in the establishment of private marine protected areas, where basically people are excluded, or even the state to a certain degree is excluded from setting rules and so on. So these are aspects we are trying to consider. And now, this actually led to that adapted framework. Just as a small sneak preview, we also changed that a little bit and developed it further. This is just the first figure which we developed and showed in the Mare conference, and we're still not yet sure. It's actually something which combines the IAD framework and the interactive governance framework, and we're not yet sure on where we are going to do. We're going to go with that framework. But for now, we stay with the kind of changed IAD framework, and now I'm moving back to the case of Sechura, and I briefly tell you, using the grammar of institution in a nutshell, what happened in Sechura Bay. So basically, there was nothing happening. There was nothing happening in that bay apart from small-scale fishers, but you had some small-scale fishers who were doing basically wild catch. You had no scallop farming at all. You had no scallop farming at all in Sechura Bay. And some fishers from Pisco area arrived, and they were realizing, okay, the production situation is pretty good, and we should start farming there. And they basically came to a situation where, from their perspective, it was a de facto open access situation. They just could go there and install themselves. And for the first 10 years, there was basically no conflict at all. There was no conflict with the small-scale fishers, which used to do their already wild catch. But the problem then was obviously that the return on investment was extremely high. So they earn a lot of money. The biophysical characteristics, the biophysical conditions were extremely favorable in those years, and they made a lot of money with that, and it led to a gold rush. And many people were basically coming, and basically occupying more and more places in that bay, and that led basically to a de facto enclosure. No state intervention at all, but you would have been shot dead if you would have come into that area. And even then, obviously, strong conflicts arise, because despite the fact that the scallop farmers only needed the seafloor, they nevertheless also kicked out all the other small-scale fishers who went for other fishes, because they were fearing that they would take the scallops. So from that perspective, it comes to a de facto enclosure. But that is obviously not a very comfortable situation if you have to defend your plot all the time with gun. And as said, that is a pretty intensive process. So from that perspective, what they managed to do basically in 2001, a law was passed, and that basically allowed only small-scale fishers in associations to get a license for a bottom culture in Sechura Bay. So basically that became a de jure common property regime. It was formalized, and basically, I mean, those who are in fisheries, you know, TERFs, territorial use rights for fishers, and that was granted basically to so-called OSPA, so Association of Small-Scale Fishers. Then the biophysical conditions did not become so optimal, and a lot of people went bankrupt. El Nino, La Nina arrived, it became warmer, and whatever 1-2 grow out cycles basically died, and that created a lot of problems for those small scale fishers. And basically a lot of potent investors came in. You can imagine you need 30,000-40,000 euros to basically annual investment into that affair, and then all those 8 months that you have to wait, and all the labor and all the boats you need to rent and so on. That's pretty costly. And so other companies came in to basically invest into that production process, and obviously to secure actually their rights and their investments, they basically made a kind of tunneling privatization, or they basically made contracts with those small scale fishers, which allowed basically them to control a lot of property rights, at least de facto. So from that perspective, it evolved towards a de facto private property regime, where actually rather big companies, for example, the biggest company is investing every year 1 million into seeds, and that's just the seeds alone. And so you can see that now rather big producers are dominating that system. And luckily enough for them, it was also kind of an uncomfortable position. This situation, I remember the discussion with the manager of Iprisco, who was basically telling me how annoying it is basically to make contracts under such an informal setting, and how difficult it is. And they have been lucky. They basically put in, or they did not put it, but all together within the Peruvian legal system, a law was passed that any type of business may hold a license in Sechura Bay, and actually those who are cooperative, they even have to create a company with a private legal status to be allowed to continue operating their business. So from that perspective, that private property regime was basically formalized. Okay, so now going into the explanation. I start describing the overall situation. I realize I have to be a little bit quicker. So the biophysical environment is that you need an awful lot of space. Basically, the entire bay is taking up. You have very sensitive water conditions, or the scallops are very sensitive to water conditions. They require an extremely quick processing. It's a pretty highly knowledge-intensive production process. From the socioeconomic conditions, we've seen all the labor which is involved, all the monitoring and harvesting. It's a pretty labor-intensive, and it's a capital-intensive production process. When you see what has been the institutional arrangement at the beginning, you had basically artisanal small-scale fishing, and you had an open access regime. So what we are interested in is how the catching and the culturing basically is organized. At the beginning, you only had those small-scale fishers, two groups. On the one hand, the capture fisheries from Sechura, which have been there for a long time, and then all the migrants who came to venture basically and find their new business opportunities and so on. So at the beginning, you had plenty of space, but then after a certain moment, the space became pretty scarce, and due to those big businesses which managed to basically get into the European export market, the commodity became more and more valuable. The commodity became more and more valuable. I don't know what you know about Colombia, but about Peru, but Peru is basically a country with huge experiences in developing the informal sector. Those small-scale fishers who came from the Pisco area were those informal fishermen, and they basically had a huge advantage in comparison to a formal business starting there. They just started and did their business, and it was a Wild West situation where they started actually the the production, and they had huge experience in basically a tradition on informal privatization. So the dominant actors in that time were basically those entrepreneurial small-scale fishers, which started to make a fortune and which had the possibility to actually invest into that process. They had basically easy profits and so on. You had this gold rush, Wild West, and you got this de facto enclosure. The problem of that, as said, the problem of that production process due to the biophysical conditions, it is too big for actually one small-scale fishers to produce on his or her own. Or it's basically only men who are producing at that place, at the primary production. So it is too big. So people basically need to unite and work together. They have built a lot of social capital in organizing themselves. And they have been lucky. They basically took that blueprint of turfs, which they copied from the Chileans, who had a similar scallop production process already ongoing. And with their organizational capabilities, they have been actually quite good in putting that system into place and to force, but it was a mixture between on the regional level and on the national level. And they basically have been able to install such de jure common property regime in 2001. Then the problem was actually those biophysical conditions did not continue to be as favorite as they have been. Basically, La Nina arrived. They had, as said, whatever 2 or 3 growth cycles which have been destroyed. And due to the socioeconomic conditions of those small-scale fishers, which were in lack of any institutional structure for credit or insurances, and the huge inequality which were there, basically they had no chance to continue their production. And as said, a lot of informal contracts about risk sharing and investment basically arrived, and that was basically those potent investors which came there had the opportunity to put that in place. A lot of small-scale fishers went bankrupt, and that led basically to a de facto installation of private property. I forgot now, it's set in the paper which percentage of plots are basically held by huge investors, but it's the huge majority, roughly about 80%. So as the investors
Achim, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry that I'm interfering. I think you need to speed up a little bit so that we have time to discuss maybe the last phase and then sum up.
Perfect. No problem at all. I mean, you know how the story goes. It's basically clear in that sense that they have been actually able to formalize, make those informal institutions formal, and now they're holding secure rights in their hands. So to basically summing up, so the biophysical and socioeconomic conditions played a key role in understanding that institutional change. Available institutions and discourses, if you remember that discourse on turfs has played a pretty important role in shaping the action space of some actors, and it's pretty interesting that actually rather less powerful actors like the small-scale fishers have been able in the first place to install their most favorite common property regime, which nevertheless locked out those who have been there before. It was interesting to see that actually the winners and losers have changed over time, and somehow the biophysical and socioeconomic conditions and the institutional structure basically seem to have made it this privatization process basically unavoidable, and only additional institutional structures like credit schemes or insurance schemes would have helped basically to keep that common property regime, which was first installed, going. Okay, thank you very much. I'm done. I'm very much looking forward to any comments and discussion points. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Achim. That was really fast, but gives us some time to talk. I already see some hands up, and I'm really grateful for this insight case study on property rights change. So also just to give a short my impression, I think it's really very interesting to see this side story, how obviously always a formal change in property rights is the second step after the informal change, and that seems to happen twice or three times in the case study you mentioned us. So maybe that gives us even some generalizing thought if it always has to be or is always like that. I see then Luc with the hand up, but maybe before we address all our points, Achim, you had also the general question to us about analytical focus, or maybe you can post that again, what your question was from your paper.
Okay.
That was in the beginning slides that you were interested to discuss with us.
Yeah, okay, I just repeat it because it's difficult for me to do multitasking. So just that I'm interested in what do you think actually in changing, or in how far you think the IAD framework is a suitable tool for understanding those privatization processes, and how would you go about it? How would you actually do that?
Okay, great. So we keep that in mind for somebody who has some feedback on that. And then Luc, you have a question. So just unmute yourself and go ahead.
He has a lot of books.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, this is a very interesting case study. There's lots of questions. Maybe I'll just focus on a couple. Do you have any sense of causality here? What led to what? What led to the formalization? What led to the demarcation? And so forth. There's a lot of endogenous variables here in the model that I see you proposing, but it's very hard to know what led to what, and without that, it's a little hard to know what we've learned here. So maybe you can comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, well, 1 second. I mean, basically, and it's very difficult. You would have to read the entire paper. It's very difficult to tell the story in a convincing way, or potentially I did not manage to tell the story in a convincing way, and you would get a lot more detail in the written paper, because I mean somehow the paper tries in a qualitative way to explain, provide sufficient reasoning why we believe that the process has taken place as it has taken place. So from that perspective, you would say, as I was arguing at the beginning, I mean, the advantage of those, and that refers also to that combination between formal and informal, which Insa was referring to. I mean, it was the advantage of those small-scale fishers who could basically venture into a new business without being regulated by anything, and just going there. And they were basically willing to, whatever, if they started on a very low scale. They basically only ventured their life and their time, basically, and they started with a very small business, and they built that up slowly but surely. And then it was and then obviously once you had this huge scarcity of those plots, it was obviously in their interest, securing their investments and so on, to formalize that situation. And then it were particular those biophysical, the biophysical environment, the Marea Roja, which came in and destroyed destroyed basically their production, which then led to the big investors coming in and being able to take over the rights from those small scale producers. So from that perspective, I would just say causality might not be the right word, but the paper actually tries to provide sufficient reason for explaining what happened there.
Achim, I think, and I had a similar observation, that Dean's question got a bit further, like what can we learn from that? You also post in your paper that it is a conventional case for some aspect, and then you have all these rich details. But if we want to look from there into the future in terms of common theory also, because in the middle term, they had these collective property rights, which then were just dismantled, which were no more active, and you gave some reasons why. So, but what can we learn then from that? Or is there something where you think with additional studies there is some generalizable information?
Yeah, I mean, as said, from my perspective, initially I basically used that as a showcase and to learn something about a framework. A framework which we want to develop. So from that perspective, it was like a first application. If you think about what could we learn from a collective action or commons perspective, then I mean, if you're looking at those common property regimes which you're establishing somewhere, and you're not taking into but that's potentially, you might say that's an old hat, saying that obviously indeed you have to consider the biophysical conditions which are out there. That was one of the pretty important features. But then also, I mean, the institutional environment surrounding that, basically the other action arena, if you might say so, haven't been developed for actually complementing all those institutions which emerged in that particular in relation to access to the bottom of the seafloor. And this did not work because in other areas no institutions had developed. So if you do not have a credit scheme, if you do not have an insurance scheme, then this seems to be the logical consequence.
Okay. Leonardo, do you have a comment or question also related to that?
Yeah, very much related. Thank you, Insa, and thank you, Achim, for your presentation and for the paper in general. It's very much related to the current topic of discussion, and also I think my question also addresses this interest of yours, Achim, on how to complement or how to strengthen the analytical framework in general, right? I think the paper does a wonderful job at qualitatively describing the transition between the phases, right? But just as I think Lueg and Insa are, Dan and Insa are describing, I also ended up thinking, well, why that particular transition and not other form of institutional change took place, right? And I wonder whether there is an opportunity to grab a political ecology lens and describe, like, to go deeper into those transitions, to describe like what exactly happened, what were, like, I don't know, the power dynamics behind that transition that actually framed and ended up being that transition, right? Just to give an example from the de jure commons to the de facto private property transition. You also just discussed it 1 minute ago. I was wondering, like, whether there were any actual processes of organization, local organization, or resistance to the de facto privatization. I don't know, by increasing their small fisher representation to the state, and why did they fail, or why didn't they occur, right? For example, that would be a question that could describe why this specific transition took place, why this specific change and not another one, right? Why didn't the jure common actually strengthen to that process? So adding this political ecology dimension to that transition might actually give another understanding and more causality to that institutional evolution narrative, right?
Yeah,
I don't know.
And maybe it even is a bigger question, relates back to your question, Achim, if then the IAD framework is so perfect, or if it can be linked with political economy and political ecology frameworks, maybe also.
Yeah.
Do you have a quick reaction on those thoughts?
A quick reaction. Leonardo, you're extremely right. I mean, power struggles have played a huge importance in that entire process. And it's interesting how actually basically the small scale fishers used the power they had in hand. They have been extremely weak in relation to money they have at hand, in relation to knowledge. I mean, if you just see how whatever Iprisco is managing the process with marine biologists, understanding exactly the cycles, they know exactly when the bad weather comes and so on. And this is really a fight, David against Goliath, yeah? And you then have those small scale fishers, yeah, which are using basically this discourse on turfs, on social justice and whatever, which tries to help them actually put those things through. They are not that bad on the local level, but they don't manage at all. They don't manage at all on the national level, and they basically fail due to the economic conditions they are in. And then coming to the second thing, you're right. I mean, the IAD framework is similar to the SES framework. I would say. I mean, there is not much theory in there, and you would need to add it from elsewhere, from other areas. And yes, indeed, that is a necessity.
Mm-hmm. I have a question here in the chat before we continue with Jamie. Fong, do you want to read it out or say a sentence more? What exactly you would like to ask? It's a very particular question, no?
Hi. I would like to ask you that what is the discourses they use in this policy reform and how you analyze it? That is my question. Thank you so much.
So that you are talking about the method used in the discourse analysis?
Yes, and I would like to know about what kind of discourse they use in the area to change the policy. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot. Basically, there have been two pretty important discourses used in that process. The one was about the turfs. Yeah. So whatever, and it was very much relating to equality questions and so on, that it's pretty, and they copied basically that discourse. It was in the overall political realm, yeah, and small scale fishers were saying, oh, that's pretty useful. And you can see that while doing interviews with people, you can see that what was actually published at that time in local newspapers and so on, and just with the help of qualitative interviews. And then now in that second phase, yeah, where this kind of formalization took place, that you had to install basically a proper private company to be able to, and that was very much the discourse which was used there was basically, okay, if we want to meet hygienic standards and we want to be sure that the export market remains open, if we are making sure that basically the Peruvian society can basically make also some gains from that process, we need to formalize it so that we can tax it and so on. And that was more that discourse, whatever you could say, a new public management discourse, which was then used for the second phase, and that also relied basically on interviews with people and what was written at that time basically in newspapers on the local and to a lesser degree on the national level, but also whatever publications from SANIPES and so on, and the Ministry of the Environment, which changed basically the law.
Thank you so much.
Jamie, your question.
Hi, thank you so much, Insa and Achim. I've really enjoyed your paper. I was really fascinated by your outline of the ways that the institutions and the property rights were changing. That was really fascinating to me, and I think I can use that in some of my own work, so thanks. something that I particularly seem to be attuned to is like manifestations of like the idea of culture. And you mentioned that in your paper, particularly in the abstract a couple of times. I'm going to your paper and you talk about, I'm sorry, hold on a sec. Talk about like finding the ideal cultural conditions and then scallop culture. So you talk about scallop culture is highly profitable. Does that mean like the idea of animal husbandry rather than like cultures surrounding institutions?
That is very interesting and reminded me of the problem when I used to start when I started to work with a lot of ecologists in my institute, yeah, and they were all the time talking about community, and I realized, okay, they're not talking about people living together as a community, and I mean, you're saying basically scallop culturing, yeah, culture in that sense of whatever producing scallops, yeah. But I mean, if you see, I mean, and that relates potentially back to what Insa was saying about this kind of how informal structures are first installed and then they are moving to formal structures and then it gets on in the next cycle and so on. I mean, I think there is a culture, and I think, I mean, I basically portrayed it as a process from informal to formal to informal and formal. But basically, there are layers. If you would look to more diverse rules, which are basically surrounding the entire management of scallop farming, yeah, then you would realize it's such an interesting mix of informal and formal institutions, and there is a culture of I mean, now not culture in the social sense, yeah. There is a culture of combining that in an extremely taking always the most advantageous thing of everything, yeah. I mean, in certain areas, those big companies are arguing, you have to formalize things, otherwise we will lose our license, then we can't export anymore to France, yeah. And then on the other hand, when it's pretty useful to use a compressor diver, which doesn't, which is basically not extremely complying with a lot of rules and so on, but there you're loving to use the informal business, and yes, obviously all those boats, they are regular. That is an informal business using subcontractors and so on. So yeah, sorry that that the word of scallop culture.
Well, a follow-up question is because you are talking about both kinds of cultures, right? The cultures around, you know, and so I think it's really important to define that in your paper, you know, for clarity. And also what you're calling culture to me looks like sort of more like a political climate or like legal institutions rather than like kind of what other people, anthropologists, think of as culture, which is, you know, like the language that people use and their habits and customs. I think you are referring to some of that anthropological sense, but be sure to clarify that that's what you're doing. Because you are talking about like informal customs versus of the local fishers versus the formal customs of the businesses. But really highlighting that will bring a lot of clarity.
I'm really agreeing with you that it should be made clear, but I would contradict in saying that I do not understand that kind of what potentially social anthropology would understand as culture, that I'm meaning that this plays an extremely huge role. If you think, for example, the seeds for those scallops farming, yeah, they are brought basically from a nature reserve, Isla de Lobos, pretty close by, yeah. And you go into the regional office and you see a big poster, and that's saying, okay, you get at least 5 years of prison when you are basically when you are taking those. And it's normal practice, and everybody is really recognizing that. it's normal to take that, yeah, and it's deeply ingrained. It's deeply ingrained into Peruvian culture. I mean, I should we have potentially, yes, we have Peruvians in the audience. I should not say too much about what is deeply ingrained, but what I got from is it's pretty clear that yes, you have the legitimate right basically to basically get those seeds from the wild, and that is normal. That is just.
Jamie, if you have more comments on a particular wording, maybe you can also engage bilateral and send a quick email to Achim just with some concerns you have about certain terms. Gustavo, you may have the last question in a minute if I can manage to squeeze in very shortly, but it's a bit abstract. I don't know if it can. You can try to answer it quickly just for a short thought, because you wanted to know if the IAD framework might be a good help here. So, and I was wondering if you refer on the other way around to use the IAD framework. Why is then the abductive method a good starting point? How is that linked to each other? Because that's a debate we currently have here a bit at the workshop, how theory and framework leads to certain start and methods.
Potentially, I don't understand exactly your question.
You have that in your paper. You have that in your paper that you start with.
Okay. I mean, if you would think it's basically, I mean, abductive approach, you would say, okay, it's a diagnostic approach where you start like a doctor from a checklist. You're thinking, okay, this. I basically address all those issues, and from there I'm moving onwards and basically diving deeper into a particular aspect where I think, okay, this is the most relevant thing, where there is actually a problem in the system or something which might explain why this patient has a particular disease. So from that perspective, I wouldn't think that it is in general a contradiction to use an abductive approach with the IAD framework.
No, I'm not saying that. I was just interested in where you see so it's this checklist that helps us to get the understanding of the problem orientation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Gustavo, do you still want to raise your question? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I try to be as brief as possible. So I was wondering if, to some extent, what we are talking about is essentially a traditional Latin American efficiency inequality trade-off. Essentially, the efficient way to go is to have these kind of large scale operations with formal rights. Then the government can tax those things and redistribute elsewhere. But then there are losers. Those small scale guys will lose. And that's essentially kind of the problem of not dealing with that properly is kind of the eternal problem of Latin America, no? Mm-hmm. So this is kind of a small scale example of a larger problem. And then the second thing is who owns the rights to decide, essentially, because so local governments in Peru, I don't know if they have something to say about that. My understanding would be that probably the national government has a lot to say. So it may be the case that the national government is changing from disregarding this to assigning more formal property rights, no?
Mm. Yeah. Basically, to start with the latter, or basically to start with the third thing, I would say yes, indeed, it could be a very a story which you find in many other places relating to efficiency versus inequality and so on, and the trade-offs between there. And then the second thing, I mean, that relates also to, I mean, I just told the story about the access rights, and what you realize that, okay, there are so many other issues involved, there are other action situations. And if you see that process, that was deeply influenced also by that struggle between the national government and the local regional government, and also that changes in property rights also meant that certain rights which initially, because they were small scale fishing, were at the regional authority, where also the small scale fishers had more possibilities to actually influence the rights, and they were basically taken away from the national government to be able, actually, as you were saying, to tax the entire process. So from that perspective, you would have to also dig deep into that action situation and talk about the power bargains going on that level, which also has influenced very much that process.
Achim, I thank you so much, and all the group. That was a fascinating, really deep case study. So I'm really happy that we had the chance to start our series this semester with your talk and your case study. Next week, we will meet at the same time, same Zoom room, with a talk from Ted Ho from here, IU Campus, Kelly School of Business on Health Systems. So you are very warm welcome and invited to join this as well. So let us use the opportunity to thank Achim. Thanks a lot for joining from abroad. I don't know, Scott, is there something else you would like to add as announcements?
No, that's perfect, Inza. No, we have our orientation for the research series this Wednesday, so there's not a normal research series event, but that will begin next week. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining, and great job again, Achim and Inza. Fantastic job moderating.
Bye.
Have a great day.